Okay. Welcome everybody to this evening's session on tree identification with Piers Voysey, the forester here at CWA. I'm delighted to invite you along to the session. Before we begin, I'd like to just talk a little bit about CWA and who we are and what we do, so please forgive me for stealing the show just very briefly. CWA helps communities connect to their woodlands, essentially. We have over 200 members, most of whom are community groups owning or managing woodland in Scotland. One of the benefits of being a member of a community woodland association is that we advocate in the political arena on behalf of our members. So, for example, we were currently or recently at the Rural Affairs Committee in Edinburgh, where our director represented CWA members at that event. We also provide support and advice to communities who are looking to start up a community woodland group or who already have a woodland and are looking for ongoing support. We listen to our members' needs and then support with training sessions such as this one, exchange visits, which we've had a few of late, mentoring programmes which are currently ongoing, and we also have our annual conferences in the autumn. We have Piers Voysey in our team, our professional forester, who is supporting today's session, but he also provides paid advice and consultancy to any groups. And we work in partnership with strategic partners across Scotland to make it easier for our communities to be actively involved in woodland management. So if you're not a member and you quite like to be a member, you can find out all about our membership, our different types of membership and what we offer, either through scanning this QR code just now or throughout the presentation. I will put the link into the chat if you would like to see further. So without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass you over to Piers, who we're delighted to have on this session today. So Piers, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and very nice to be here and to see you all still joining in. Now, I wonder how many of you did your homework. We put up the advert for this session as being something like, if you want to know a bit about tree identification, here's some good online resources. Go to these and have a little explore with these resources. And then if you've still got questions and you want to try and nail those problems down, then we could sort of turn this into a bit more of a discussion and help each other get through that. Now, I'm aware that some of you may have come along with expectations also that I'm going to tell you everything about tree identification from scratch. So can I ask, first of all, where are we at? What are people needing from this session? Shall I make slide presentations? Shall I show some twigs, or have you got questions for me?
Let me unspotlight you, Piers, and then we can see more people on the screen and maybe people can turn their cameras on or stick their hands up and just tell us exactly how we can shape this session for you. So Chris has said, winter idea of less common species. Anybody else got any suggestions of what they would like to see? Jack's coming on just now. John, and you come, unmute and you come.
All right, I think, were you going to say something? No. I was just looking for more information about how to, I did do some homework, yeah, I did look at the, it was a YouTube presentation, I can't remember who it was by. It gives some details how to identify trees, but it didn't go into a lot of detail. He started talking about alternate buds and opposite buds, so I got a bit confused at that point, but it was quite interesting. And I looked at there was an app which I put on my phone, which was quite good as well. But I've only really just had a quick look at that. Didn't actually use it as much because I only looked at it last night. So, but I thought the presentation was good. I'd just like a bit more detail on tree ID because we have a small woodland and we know some of the trees, but we'd like to know more about which different trees are there. So it'd be useful to have some pointers about how to do it. So I was hoping for a bit of a presentation.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. Let me do a screen share, and we'll talk a little bit about the detail of twigs, and then and buds, and then we can talk about what a tree looks like in the woodland and what maybe its general form is. And then we can talk a little bit about how you can then pick up on these things in the landscape as well, and how trees appear a bit in the landscape, so that you, as you're walking through the landscape, you can begin to see what's going on, and how the land's being managed and what the sort of soils are or what the habitats are. So let me see if I can get a screen share to work.
Piers, we also have Heather. She's got her hand up as well. So Heather, just unmute and come in.
Yeah, I've got a specific question. I'd quite like to know how to tell the difference between an aspen and a poplar. And I have a photo of a mystery tree that's grown in our woodland, and I just wondered if you would take a look at that as well at some point, maybe at the end.
Okie dokes, will do.
We've also got Jack has said he wants a book on trees in the order they appear in his garden. Same for a bird book. I think that would be utopia for all of us, Jack. And he said twigs would be good, and bark, especially of elm and young oak, as opposed to older examples. Sorry, doesn't have any photos.
Okie dokes, let me come back to you now and see if I can do a screen share.
Your managers need me to do that for you.
Right. Am I screen sharing now?
You are. Perfect.
Okay, and you can see the presentation, tree detail.
We can.
Okay. Right. Close-ups of terminal buds. Okay, if I talk about a terminal bud, then this is the bud at the end of the twig. And then you've got little side buds, lateral buds. And when it talks about opposite and alternate, it means it's referencing how the buds appear on the twig, so that there's relatively few species that have opposite buds. The maples, ash, blackthorn, things like that have opposite buds. And in the case of ash, it gives this trident-like appearance when you look at it in profile, with the big leading black bud and the two little side buds. And ash buds are always black. Okay, so that's an easy one for ash. This one is one with chunkier reddish buds, and if you look at them, it's like there's one big part of the bud and then kind of a scale of the, so the buds are enclosed in scales, and how these scales are formed are indicative of the species as well. It's not the best photograph, but it's a chunky bud, reddish bud on a brown twig, and it looks a little bit like a boxing glove. It's got a big chunky bud and a little thumb scale on one side, and that is very characteristic of lime trees. And then we're into slightly hairy buds. And so when you look at the bud scales, you have to go looking quite closely. Can be useful to get a hand lens onto them. Some of them are really pretty in detail. This is a rowan bud, and it's slightly hairy. Get these silvery looking hairs on it. This is another one of the opposite formed buds. So the buds come in opposite pairs, orientated in one plane and then oriented in the other plane. So you only see one bud on the side of that twig, but the other one's hiding. And just at the bottom of the picture, you've got the next pair of buds. This is a common tree around Britain. It's got a green terminal bud. So that's sycamore. And in comparison, then the Norway maple has red buds. And then the other thing to look for is what's coating the twig. So as well as the buds and the shape of the buds and the number of scales and how the scales on the buds are oriented, look at the sides of the twigs and whether it's warty or hairy or smooth, whether it's brown, grey, all of the bits of colour that go with it. And this is a very warty, rough bark. If you rub your fingers, if you rub it through your fingers, it's very much like a very coarse sandpaper. That is silver birch, quite characteristic. The other one that's quite a lumpy bark, but very different tree, is elder. And this is a common yew. Almost the buds are almost microscopic, and the needles arranged in a bit of a plane. So what are you looking for? You're looking for the color of the twig. You're looking for the arrangement of the needles and the size and the color of the buds, again on the conifers. So this is common yew. Very similar, but slightly more delicate in a way, softer feeling. The feel and the smell can be important as well on conifers. Whether the needles are fairly evenly spaced either side, or whether they're different lengths or even lengths. This is western hemlock from a hedge tree. Again, tiny buds. Hardly notice the buds at all, but a very pale arrangement of the underside of the needles. And then when you're looking at bigger trees in the woodland, bark obviously needs to be one of your, well, barks and leaves if you can't see the twigs. And if the leaves are on, then that's good indication. But sometimes you bump into a tree and it's just like, whoa, this is big, and you've only got the lower part to really work with. So get an idea as to how the bark forms, whether it's smooth, whether it's deeply creased, fissured, whether the fissures become flattened, whether they change color from the inner bit of the from the canyons in between the bark ridges to the outer side. This is a common ash, very grey in aspect, but quite, yeah, what would you say about ash? For me, it's the greyness of it, and on an old tree like this, generally quite massive, quite a heavy looking tree. Ash again, with its greyish, lovely ridges and valleys. This fluting at the base, this is common for a lot of trees, but ash was particularly well respected for that, because it's these flares that the Irish would make their hurley sticks from. So the stick part, or the shaft of the stick, would be from the trunk, and they'd use the flare from the root, from the buttress, to make the paddle, the blade of the hurley stick. different bark arrangement. This bark, old tree, it's gone platy. You've got these knobbles where there once were branches. This is sycamore. So that's quite characteristic of sycamore. And it's another sort of platy bark that you will bump into in some places is London plane, but those plates are slightly differently coloured, and you get a lovely mottling on London plane compared with sycamore. Sycamore tends to be a fairly uniform grey, but the older bark becomes quite platy. But for most of its life, the sycamore bark is very smooth, and you won't notice the plates until the trees got very old. And so this crooked tree in the background, in the sort of middle background of the photo, that's sycamore bark when it's pretty young. And then this one looks like the ash, but is a little, the fissures and the ridges aren't as well defined. Particularly on this one, if you look at this part of the tree, it's almost becoming more broken up. All of the ridges are more broken up and it's less longitudinally fissured. So that's an oak tree. I wouldn't know whether it's Quercus petraea, the sort of sessile oak, or the Quercus robur, the English oak, but one of the oaks, common oaks for Britain. A characteristic of oak is that some of them form epicormic shoots around the trunk. And so this can be characteristic of oak trees. You won't see it on ash, I don't think. You might see it on elm. So that's what might be called a pippy oak butt. It's the bottom part of the tree that would be quite sought for sawmilling, because furniture makers might be able to do something with the pippy grain and to use it to good effect. Interestingly, here is the smooth sycamore trunk, and next to it, pressed in closely, is a tree with very horizontal lenticels. Lenticels, possibly a new name for you. It's how the tree trunk breathes. These are where the bark enables air to get oxygen to get in, basically, or carbon dioxide to come out as the tree grows. Underneath the bark is the growing part of the tree that enables it to put on diameter, girth, and so that part of the tree needs to breathe. Doesn't get all of its resources from the leaves, so it needs to have a contact with the air. And these lenticels are very characteristic of different trees. You won't notice it. You won't notice the lenticels in a big old mature tree like this, because they've all disappeared under that very thick corky layer, and they'll probably be getting some oxygen through the bottom of the cracks. But this is a younger cherry tree. Cherry has very, very noticeable horizontal arrangement of lenticels that makes it look a little tiger striped. But if you just show me 3 trees like this and bark like this, it's like, whoa, where do you start? And it's not easy just looking at a trunk like this and going, yep, I know exactly what that is. You need a lot more information usually about the tree as to what it might be, what's going on. And you combine not just the form of the bark, but the stature of the tree, how it's growing, whether it's growing straight up, whether it's very crooked and twisted. You look at the twigs to try and work out what the buds are like. You look for leaves under the trees if it's in winter. You look for leaves on the tree if it's spring and summer. At this time of year, you might be looking for some flowers on the twigs. Or earlier in the winter, you might be looking for, I mean, even this time of year, you might see debris of old flowering and fruiting on the tree. So some rowan trees at the moment still have the little stalklets that held the berries, and that can be helpful in identifying some of the rosaceae, like rowan, because they've still got these little clusters, the stalks from the fruiting clusters. So the tree in the middle, I've put a little twig up against it. You've got these little glossy brown buds, very pressed against the stem, rather like willow is pressed hard against the stem. The buds are hard against the stem, but you can see very closely that there are several scales. You can pick out individual scales on the buds, whereas on willow, you will only see one smooth covering. There's only a single bud scale covering a willow bud. So this isn't willow, and it's got these little longitudinal lenticel markings. And then the bark of this particular specimen has got some sort of glossy purpley brown showing through it. So that's bird cherry. And the one next to it, with rather like the common cherry, with quite horizontal lenticels on the young trunk, but also quite characteristic grey mottling from the lichen that grows on rowan. So a young oak trunk might look a little bit like this, but this is a young rowan. And once you get your eye in for different trees, then you begin to look, you begin to notice the sort of characteristics of those trees at different ages, at different stages of their life. What lichens are growing on them, how smooth they are, how the lenticels form. And the one on the left here, quite linear in its appearance, you know, vertical striping, but a very vertical form on these coppice shoots. That's lime, not small leafed lime, but just common lime. So that's kind of the, yeah, that's come to the end of that little bit of slideshow. So I'll stop sharing. And someone was asking about poplars. I don't know, I've got a little bit of light from the top, and it's not going to be the best lighting to show you a poplar twig, and I don't know whether I can get the camera to go close enough to it. Poplars have very, very pointy buds, and the aspen is the same. But what makes this one stand out as not aspen is its general size of bud. So compared with my pinky, it's almost as, you know, it's getting on for being as big as my little finger nail, which is kind of too big for our common aspen. And at this time of year, you might see some of these trees in flower. So they've just produced their catkins, and some of them might be beginning to release a smell. So there's a balsam poplar, which smells very strongly of balsam as soon as the buds are getting at all big and swelling up, ready to burst. I think this is a hybrid poplar or a white poplar. I'm not sure which one. There's not a lot else I can say about this particular twig, except I am noticing on the first year growth, it's going to be impossible to show you, I think, but it's kind of slightly pressed into little ridges. So last year's twig has got a few little ridges on it, which is also something that you might find on field maple, but field maple is much more pronounced, and you get these snaking ridges that run up the twigs, and they then stay on that branch for some time. Whereas on this particular sample of white poplar, I think it is, then the ridges very quickly disappear, and the twig becomes very standard brown, round looking, with very not very visible. Yeah, I appreciate that showing you samples on the screen isn't going to be a great way of doing it. I think the slides did work better. I'll see if okay, if I hold this up a little bit, can you see that well enough?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Can you see the colour well enough? Much browner, much redder than the sycamore. Again, this is the opposite buds, two buds side by side, well, one on either side of the twig, very red in colour. So that's Norway maple compared to the green of the sycamore. Other trees with very pointy buds, but is beech, and that pointiness you can see in mature trees in the landscape. So and the other feature about beech is the young trees or trees in a hedge hang on to their leaves through the winter, all brown, dried up, and they will get pushed off and fall out as the new leaves come on, and they will drop during the spring and summer. But all through the winter they'll be there. Big old mature beech trees, they don't hang on to their leaves. So it's only the younger leaves in the understory and trees that are being used in the hedge that work, that hang on to their leaves. Have we got any questions at this stage?
Let me just stop highlighting you a second and then we can see people. Anyone got any questions?
Oh, someone was, yeah, Hebe, you're asking about elm. Does it help to hold this little picture up? Now is the time for elm flowers. They are very early flowering, rather like aspen and the poplars. So these little flower buds are just breaking out. So when you look up at elm, you get this sort of knobbly appearance against the sky. And that's the flower buds just appearing. Otherwise, elm, yeah, I'll show you a picture of an elm shortly, that gives you some idea of as to how it might differ from oak. But for me, the elm buds are much more purplish brown than in oak, and they're fairly pointy, so quite pointy buds, but they're not as long, slender bud. They're quite a robust bud, but they come to a nice fine point, and they're slightly hairy, and the twig is slightly soft feeling. It's not warty or lumpy, but neither is it hairy like a hazel twig, perhaps. But yeah, characteristic, certainly in this month, is that elm has started to flower. Give me a a moment to pause and find the next presentation.
Anybody learn something that they didn't know before?
Yes.
Tell me, Jen.
I've never heard of lenticels.
You neither.
And Piers, I was going to ask, so if you look at you would only see them on young trees before the sort of bark appears on older trees. And do they have for different species, do they have their own pattern of lenticels, quite distinct?
Yes, but they go in kind of sort of families. So the cherries, the prunus, the young bark on a cherry until it's semi-mature, you get this very horizontal formation banding, and it does appear on bird cherry, but not as strongly. Common cherry, the geen, is really clear, really characteristic. On the poplars and willows, the lenticels are diamond shaped, which is why some traditional cultures thought of those trees as being spirits in the wood that were watching you. They look like eyes looking at you from out in the woods. So when you find trees with diamond shaped lenticels, then you know you're dealing with the willows, the poplars group. And for me, those are the only things that sort of popping to mind at the moment in terms of lenticel characteristics.
And then so if they're for breathing, what happens when they develop the older trees develop their bark? Do they not need to breathe?
Well, I think the air is then getting in the bottom of the fissures.
Okay.
In other ways, yeah. Have I started screen sharing again?
Not yet, no.
Not yet, right. Let me see if I can.
There we go.
Now,
That's
great. Technology working to my favor. Okay, looking at tree characters. Big, massive trees like this. Look at those spreading roots, quite superficial, coming out in big splays. A lot of cavities, a lot of young shoots trying to come up from the base, branching coming out quite low, big heavy limbs. But look how this is a very, very old tree, but look how smooth the bark is still, although it's beginning to crack up. It's still a relatively smooth grey bark. All of that characteristic is very indicative of European beech. And that's a rather slightly poorer, very much poorer photograph of a beech tree. Again, the smooth grey bark, but look how fine the twigs are. And that's those pointy buds. And I liked the YouTube link that I sent out with this invitation. James Kendall from Wales was talking about how beech trees are one of the few trees that you can tell what you're underneath in the winter when you walk underneath it blindfolded, and you can feel and hear the crunching of the beech nut shells under your feet. There'll be a lot of leaf litter as well, crunching around underneath your feet too. But it's those fine, very wispy twigs that are quite characteristic of a beech tree in winter when it's silhouetted like that. And in the foreground of the photo, you've got these very fine beech twigs. In the background, these trees, their characteristic is all this abundance of coppice shoots that come from the base and are very, very peculiar to a few different species. Elm has this sort of vigorous coppicing, but also your lime group of lime trees. So this is your common or garden broadleaf lime planted as an avenue along the edge of the street. They make very good street trees, very well rooted, firmly rooted. They pollard well, they coppice well. And so these reddish coppice shoots are coming off the base of the lime trees. So that is quite a sort of characteristic when you're walking into a parkland environment, or you can pick out those trees from quite a distance and say, I think I know what that is. Now, I like this photograph because it does show quite well the silhouetting of twigs against the sky. This is wych elm, and yeah, I'd call it the zigzag tree in a way. Rather like blackthorn in some respect, almost every branching is at right angles to the twig that it came off. So you get a very zigzaggy polygon type sort of arrangement of twigs when silhouetted against the sky. And I find that a really appealing feature of wych elm. You can possibly just make out the youngish bark. This is a youngish tree, but I have a feeling it's already dying back with Dutch elm. Yeah, not a lot of characteristic to that particular bark. How you might compare that with any other, with an oak, for example. But it's a different arrangement. It's rather like when you go bird watching. You get to know the jizz of a bird. You get to know the jizz of a tree. What are the general identifying features of those trees, and what does it just feel like to be in its presence? So that's wych elm with its very zigzaggy sort of branching. Not such a good photo because I zoomed in to try and compare blackthorn with hawthorn when seen in a hedgerow. Here's a young hawthorn on the left. It's very, very upright in its shoots. It wants to go up before it plateaus because it wants to be a bit bigger than the blackthorn. Blackthorn on the right, rather like elm, but very much more densely branched. 90-degree branching. Very quickly, blackthorn becomes a craggy dome and doesn't gain much more height and forms a dense covering, whereas the hawthorn wants to go up a bit higher. So that's comparing one with t'other in a hedge. But that's the hawthorn now reached its terminal height, and it's plateaued out and formed this sort of dome of quite tightly branched twiglets. But you can see that the formation of the smaller trunks underneath. It's had a period of very vigorous, I want to go up, before plateauing out and forming a dense mat like the blackthorn would do as well. So, any questions at that stage? Des.
Hi, thanks very much. Just on the that coppicing you mentioned, the kind of basal growth on those trees, that was lime and something else as well you mentioned?
elm, wych elm, does a lot
Okay.
of basal
Lime, wych
coppicing.
elm, but not beech. It was the beech tree in the foreground, but not beech so much.
Not as vigorously. Not unless it's been coppiced at a fairly young age.
But that was my other question. So that was actual coppicing. That was the result of man's intervention there, or it was
no. Those lime trees just form all of that dense coppicing at the base, those basal shoots, just without any intervention. And I think elm has can have that tendency as well. And certainly I would associate all those basal shoots on elm with maybe a bit more intervention and coppicing. So the elm tree, the wych elm tree in my garden, was pollarded but not coppiced, but it still produced a lot of basal growth. And you could see that going all the way down the tree. Once you'd taken the top out of the tree, all of the epicormic shoots were then trying to compensate for that, and that carried on all the way down to ground level. Beech trees, even as big old mature specimens, can send out small shoots very low down, but they're not as dense as other trees. And so there would be much, on an old beech tree they'd be more intermittent, these little basal shoots, but they'll still do it because beech is so shade tolerant, and sending out little shoots from the base, they'll still make something of the light, whereas a lot of light demanding trees like oak, they won't do it unless they're really forced into it.
Great, thank you.
Right, I've got one more presentation. Let me go and find that. Open it up for you. Can you see that? Trees in the landscape?
Can, thank you.
Okie dokes. So it's much better in real life, I can tell you that. When you're looking out and trying to find a photograph that really works and shows the subtlety of color in winter. Showing a little bit of texture is relatively easy. So what have we got here? What's going on in the foreground in these overhanging twigs and branches? Less obvious perhaps, but very finely twigged, very long twigs, very feathery. And look out here, this twig still got some nuts attached, last autumn's fruit cases still hanging on there. Probably no nuts left in, but just the cases. So that's beech on the right, overhanging the scene. And this is a twisted oak. Characteristic of oak, hanging on to dead branches for a long time because the heartwood is so resistant. Whereas beech, once a branch has died, within a few years it's rotted off and dropped away, whereas oak will last a long time. Oak, very crooked in its growth form. But looking out over the landscape, you've got the river and you've got the usual suspects along the river riparian strip. It doesn't show well in this photograph because it's very difficult to pick up the subtle color differences between one tree and another. But the sorts of trees you'd find on a riverbank, ash and alder. Alder has quite a lovely purplish hue to it. And then we're into planted conifers behind the riparian trees. Some conical trees, some with quite obvious main stems appearing, and others where you can't see the main stem at all. So they're much more densely branched. So where the branching is more open and the branches may be a little bit more horizontal before they sweep up, and a very grey main trunk, that's probably some species of fir. And the dense green, dark green, probably Norway spruce. You can see maybe more fir trees out in the background. And then trying to work out what's happening even beyond that, I was trying to get my eye into the different colours and densities of lichen. So where you look into an oak wood in winter, particularly in this part of the world, on Strath Tay, then a lot of lichen in the branches, and that's really quite obvious. And then I'll show you, I'll keep going because I've got better examples of the difference between oak and beech in the landscape. This shows it again a little bit more. You've got the alder in the foreground, slightly purplish. Possibility of that being an ash tree. You've got much more openly branched at the top in the crown. The alder forms rather like the hawthorn, I suppose, quite a dense, twiggy canopy, whereas the ash forms a much more open, structured, stout, twigged canopy, and much grayer in form. And that's kind of it in close-up or zoomed in a bit. You can see the alder, and that's an alder tree down there, very, very randomly twiggy, whereas this is more stoutly twigged and grayer in form, more upright. So that's the ash, and that's the alder. And what looks like just ordinary Norway spruce in the next layer, but there's a slightly darker, bluier green spruce tree in there. That's probably a Sitka spruce. Comparing Sitka spruce and Norway spruce, Norway spruce is much more that British racing green. I don't know whether you're familiar with that colour, whereas the Sitka spruce has a bluey tinge to it because of the number of stomata, or that sort of waxiness underneath the needles, but a bluier green. And Sitka spruce always appears a bit stiffer than Norway spruce. Norway spruce has these sweeping branches, and the twigs that hold the needles kind of hang down on the mature trees. So you get a much more delicate looking tree, much more graceful tree than the stout, robust Sitka. And in the background, oak wood, but where the oak wood changes a bit is you've got I think this is a beech tree with a very smooth canopy outline. I'll go on to the next photograph because I might show that a bit better. Here's the foreground of oak, quite craggy, quite twiggy, quite irregular in the crown outline. In the back there is the beech tree with a very much more smoother outline. And there's the zoomed in a little bit. You lose a bit of the photograph gets a bit grainy, but that's the outline of the beech tree in the background. Very much more of a smooth dome silhouette compared to the oak. And the oak ever so much more twiggy. And that's oak again, snake-like branching, and a lot of lichen. Similar to the beech tree, and a very similar species, is the hornbeam. This is quite a fun sort of almost conical dome of a silhouette. But again, rather like young beech trees, very upright, sweeping up, branching habit, but forming a lovely sort of regular outline to the tree. Hornbeam's not a common tree for us, more common in southern England and in the woods, where it forms an important understory, but often planted in parks because it can form quite nice feature trees that don't ever get too big. Again, trying to look at a photograph of different shapes and colours and textures of trees in the landscape. You've got white-barked birch with purplish shoots. You've got the deciduous conifers, and look how craggy and windswept the tops of these larch trees have become. It's quite a feature for larch, and this is a young larch tree and quite slender and delicate, maybe compared to the Sitka spruce, which is the bluey green conifer or evergreen conifer in the middle, and that one too. Quite a stout tree. I don't know whether it's possible to make out in the foreground, but you've got a little conifer here in the foreground, which is more slender and more green rather than blue-green. And that's a Douglas fir sapling. Behind that is a young tree that has retained its leaves, and that would be either beech or, I think in this case, one of the oaks. So that's an oak sapling that's retained its leaves into the winter. So that's taking a sort of scan on the trees out in the background there. Again, an evergreen conifer, but much less conical than your spruces. You can see the branching has become a little bit pagoda-like. That one is a reasonable example. These trees out the background there. So there's Scots pine. And so being able to read that into the landscape is kind of a little bit useful when you're out doing a survey and want to get an idea as to what's happening in a woodland, what's growing where, what's been planted in the past, how you might categorize the forest for future management, and to be able to scan through a landscape and say, I need to treat this bit of woodland separately because this is larch dominated and there's going to be a lot of different spruce regeneration coming up under that, and the pine, I'd maybe want to go in and treat that as a separate compartment. So I'll go in there and work out what my Scots pine crop's doing. So I hope that's helped with a range of different ways of looking at trees and getting an idea of different things. Rather grainy photos again. I thought that was the end of my slides, but not. There's a couple more going on. The jizz of trees in the landscape, not very easy from such grainy photographs, but a little bit about the colour, getting the colour variation between birch on a riverbank compared with the hazel, much greener, bigger leaved in comparison to the birch, which in the midsummer loses its fresh green. You know how in spring birch comes out that beautiful fresh green, but come the summer it's gone quite dowdy in a way, and then the brighter green of the hazel tends to compensate for that. Mixed conifers at the back. You've got the blue-green Sitka spruce and some larch trees as well. That may be a slightly better photograph showing the birch on the bank. If I can find my cursor again. Sitka spruce in the background, the very conical, stoutly branched European larch. But notice the dieback in the larch, so that looks like Phytophthora infection has got in. So quite a lot of dieback in the larch. That's a serious case for sanitation felling, unfortunately. Down on the riverbank, you've got this ash tree. What's telling me it's an ash tree? Color of the leaves, the general, you can't see the branching anymore. You can't see those stout twigs that are going on. But it's the way, just the way those rather, how straggly the canopy looks with the pinnate leaves. You know how ash trees have, ash leaves have pinnate leaves rather than an entire leaf. So the leaf is a central petiole with lots of little leaflets coming off either side and then a little terminal leaflet. And that makes the canopy look a little bit scruffier than if it was a single uniform leaf like the alders out in the background. But that ash tree there, you can see that the stem much grayer. The leaves are almost a little bit like sort of pom-poms out on the end. It's possible that some of these ash trees are now being infected by Cholera, and so the form, how they grow, is slightly different. How the trees appear in the landscape is slightly different. Scruffy specimen of what probably is a hawthorn tree in the field. Again, what tells me it's a hawthorn, supposition as much as anything. It's the context. A tree that has survived in the middle of a field, it's probably a hawthorn. Hasn't been grazed out, and it's not very big. But I might be proved wrong if I went up to have a closer look at it. But it's quite a scruffy tree, and bits fallen out of it, and bits grown up again. It's a very resilient tree. Cope with a lot of hassle from cattle and mammoths, things like that. Okay, that's the end of me slideshows. Have we got any more questions after that?
Can I just say, Piers, I think you have used more adjectives in the last hour than I've heard you use ever. Well done.
Stunned everybody into silence, unfortunately. Either that or, let's just say, we don't know where to begin. We don't know where to begin. Okay. I did have a look at PlantNet. I'm quite a fan of PlantNet because it's online and it's really, I mean, if you've got the connection with the internet, when you're out and about, you can take a photograph, or if not, you can take a photograph and bring it back. You can log into your broadband and then you can upload the photograph to PlantNet, and PlantNet will give it a good shot and you'll give some options. I had a look at the Woodland Trust 3ID website and I thought, oh, this is just another variation on a key. And I'm a little bit, when it says alternate, what do they mean by alternate? Or what do they, when they say, is it hairy? What do they mean by hairy? How hairy is hairy? Etc. Because you look at a twig and some of them will be generally hairy and some of them will be maybe hairy, but not very hairy. So you may, when you're trying to use a key, you have to look at more than one twig. You have to collect a little sample and set them all out. I mean, the difference might be you pick up a little birch twig and it's very slender and instantaneously it's warty. You know, it's really rough in your fingers and you know that that is a silver birch. And it's not a downy birch, because downy birch would be much smoother to feel. It's downy because it's got little hairy twigs, and so it feels very much smoother. So some things are like a real giveaway, and then others you have to collect several twigs and go of one tree and go, okay, is this generally hairy or is this not hairy? So I was struggling with the Woodland Trust key almost immediately, thinking, I'm going to go round in circles here on this. And then when you get to the end of the key, it still gives you 33 options. And I thought, oh, no, that's not helpful at all. I'd be better off with a book. I do get on pretty well with the Collins Tree Guide. Right at the beginning, lots of options in terms of looking at twigs in winter and getting an idea as to what all your different options are for twigs in winter. And then it goes into the different leaf forms. Are they scale leaves? Are they needles? Are the needles in bunches? And then with broadleaf trees, a lot of different options. Are they palmate leaves? Are they oblong leaves? Are they elliptical? Are they rounded? Yeah, it gives you a lot of good introductions and then helps you get through picture by picture. But what I think is really helpful when you're using a book is to go to a tree that you know, and you know what it is, and you take some samples of it, and you take it and you read it through with the book, and so you find where that tree is in the book. Say, for example, let's. I've opened it. Okay, for example, you go to the maples section on maples, and you get your sycamore out, okay, and you read the description about sycamore, and you look at all the different characteristics and compare that with your sample of a sycamore, and you get familiar with how the book describes what you're looking at. And you do that for several different trees that you know, and you get familiar with how the book describes that tree, and you could then have a much better idea as to what the book is going to say about other things and how to then compare it, so that when you find a tree that you don't know, you have a little bit of a head start as to how the key is going to work for you and how you understand some of the terminology that's being used. Because if you dive straight into some of these books, the terminology is sometimes quite baffling. For me, insect terminology is even more so baffling. I'm all right with trees. That's why I studied forestry. I could get on with trees. I didn't study insects because I couldn't ever remember the different bits of an insect. And yeah, and try your trees at different times of the year, and take time to go out. So you know what a wych elm looks like in summer, go out again in autumn, go out again in winter, come back again in spring, and work out all the different characteristics of that elm tree through the season, so that yeah, you get an idea of the jizz for that tree, and you'll be able to then pick them out much more easily any other time of the year. Yeah, it does take time and a bit of work, but it's fun, and you can do it with these phone apps. Yeah, for me, PlantNet would be a good way to go, because then you're being aided by the photographic options that come up. But I like walking with the Collins Tree Guide if I'm going into a park and I've got time to sort of key out different things. I like doing it with the fungi guide as well. If I'm going out looking for fungi, I'll go out with the guidebook and just spend time, if it's not too midgy, out in the undergrowth looking at fungi and getting familiar with all the different characteristics of one particular thing. So that's my approach to using the tree guides is to get familiar with the keys with trees that you know what they are, and then go out and start doing it with trees that you don't know, and then follow the trees through the season. And yeah, take a hand lens sometimes to really enjoy the fine detail, particularly now when the flowers coming out. Some of the flowers, particularly on hazel or larch, for example, these little crimson female flowers that come out really early on in the year, or elm flowers, they're stunningly beautiful at this time of year. And if you get a hand lens onto them as well, you can see all the fine detail. Any other questions? Or do you think I've left you with enough confusion?
Todd Des is typing away just now. Anyone else got anything they want to ask? I'm feeling quite inspired, Piers.
Good, good. Is everybody familiar? While I'm talking quite sort of, while I have a sample in my hand, does everybody know the difference between spruces and firs in terms of how do you tell a spruce from a fir? Very, very straightforward, one little trick in terms of looking at a little twig like this, and looking at how the needles come off the twig. And if you pull the needle off and it's left a little peg, then it's a spruce. And if it's a little circle underneath, a bit like the twig has been attached to a leech, and the leech has now come away and left a little round scar on the twig, that's a fir. And then pine, the needles are always in groups of 2 or 5 in a little sheath. So they all come out together, but there's maybe 2 together, or there's maybe 5 in a bundle. And whether it's a 2-needle pine or a 5-needle pine helps with the identification. So on Scots pine, the needles are always in pairs. And then a larch, they come out in clusters, rather like cedar of Lebanon, something like that. The needles come out in a little dense cluster on a little bump. So that's very characteristic of the larches and the cedars. So that enables you to put them into some basic groups to then go, okay, I know what group I'm working with. That's narrowed it down to 50 species or 2 species. I mean, with the larches, because they're deciduous and we're only talking about European larch and Japanese larch and hybrid larch, then you've only got 3 species once you've decided that the needles are coming out in a cluster, and it's going to be, because it's quite, well, you might know that it's deciduous, and it's not a cedar because it's a very different form of tree, very different character tree, the larch and the cedars. But yeah, you've then only got 3 trees, and so generally, if you're trying to tell between a Japanese larch and a European larch in winter, my thinking is twig color, and just what's the general shade of that, color shade of that tree. Is it straw yellow or is it reddish brown? And so if it's reddish brown, then it's a Japanese or hybridy larch. If it's very much straw yellowy color, then that's European larch. And then the general shape, European larch is one of the, when you see them in big mature trees, it's the only tree that forms these lovely hockey stick, big hockey stick branching form. And that's characteristic of some of the European larches. Not all of them do it, but if you see it, you know that it's a European larch. The larches down in Dunkeld are quite good for it. And yeah, that for me is my trick for larches. I'm trying to think what else comes to mind.
Heather's asking about the main way to tell aspen from poplar.
Tricky. For me, aspen is the more delicate buddy, delicate member of the poplars. Aspen is another poplar, but it's our native poplar. And yes, there's the American aspen, which does hybridize with our aspen. They're so closely related, they do hybridize. But you won't see much in the way of American poplar here. It's been used a little bit in trials, particularly the hybrids, for growing fast-growing timber crops. But for me, the aspen is a very delicate tree, whereas almost all the other poplars are more massive. And black poplar, which is the other native, British native poplar, more of an English species, more associated with riparian areas or water bodies, structurally very different. And when you get a white poplar, then it's much bigger and chunkier than our common aspen. So they'll stand out. I mean, even the one I found today in the street, it wasn't such a big tree, but just the twigs were so much more chunky. Everything about it was bigger than our aspen. And then down near where I live or near where I live, Aviemore, it's not too far away. Down on the riverbank, there's a couple of balsam poplars, and they stink when the leaves come out. You walk past them and you can be 100 meters away and you'll smell them. So that's when you get that smell in the spring, you know you're in the presence of a balsam poplar. And it does look a little bit different to our aspen. Again, just much chunkier leaves and chunkier buds when they come out. Our native aspen is the pretty delicate cousin of all those poplars.
Rebecca said that she thought she had mature hornbeams, but they have tall trunks, not like the triangular shape you showed. They have toothed leaves. What else could they be?
No, they could still be hornbeams grown out in the open. There's some big hornbeams on Rothymercus, but I would still say they're not massive like your oak trees. And yeah, they're not like those young trees. I gave you a photograph of some young hornbeams and those very regular canopies. Yeah, the older trees on Rothymercus have kind of lost that uniform canopy. The crown's got a bit more broken up because they've kind of reached their terminal height in a way. They're quite big, stout trees, much bigger than you would find probably in a forest in England or Europe. If it's an elliptical leaf with lots of raggedy teeth, then it could also be a sweet chestnut. And they grow into big, massive hulks. They outcompete the oak for being hulkish when they're ancient, like 400-year-old chestnuts. Just splendid. And chestnut leaves are much longer than hornbeam, much bigger. I'm trying to think. This is a dead beech leaf, very much rounder than a hornbeam leaf, but hornbeam would be similar in texture. And how I tell the difference between, obviously the shape is different because the hornbeam leaf is much more elliptical than round, like the beech leaf. But it's also a bit like the hornbeam leaf has been crimped. and it's the leaf is a little bit up and down. When you look horizontally at a beech leaf, even when it's dry, it's pretty flat, whereas the hornbeam leaf looks as though it's been crimped and it's a little bit ziggy-zagged in profile, as well as having a more saw-like edge. That for me would, and that for me would differentiate between a big hornbeam leaf and a small chestnut leaf. Would be it's got this crimped look about it.
Heather, you said you had a picture of a tree. Are you able to upload it onto the chat at all?
Yeah, I'll try and do that. That's okay.
So they're definitely hornbeams, Rebecca. That's good. Anyone else want to challenge Piers?
Please don't ask me about Chemiciparis and Cupressus and Lawson cypress, etc.
I still haven't discovered my tree that I'm wanting to identify, Piers, but I need a good photograph first.
I'll need to come up and have a look at it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a good
there we
photo. And now, what happens? Okay, I've done
You
it.
see that?
Whoa, yeah.
Got one more. It's the same
and then-
one.
In my mind, I go, yeah, I know exactly what that is. And what could it be?
So it's grown by itself near our path, and that's how we noticed it. And it's just got one main stalk to it, and it's kind of leaning towards our path.
Yeah,
And the apps that we all tried came up with several things.
options. Okay. They look a bit like horse chestnut, but I don't think that bud is fat enough. Is this photograph showing for everybody? Is it only showing for me?
People have to click on it in the chat themselves and watch it.
Okay.
It's not going to show in the slides.
No. Okay, so if you just single click on the photo, it'll pop up in your screen. That's what it's done for me. The bud is shiny, like horse chestnut, but it's maybe not as fat as I would expect horse chestnut. Quite characteristic of some trees is just how these twigs are wearing crumpled stockings. You know how like you wear leg warmers and they all fall down around your ankles or whatever. So that for me is quite characteristic. If it was horse chestnut, they would be really sticky.
They weren't sticky. We checked them.
No.
They're not sticky.
No. I'll have to get the book out. Okay. Leave it with me, and I will get back to you.
Thank you.
Who is it again?
It's Heather McClafferty.
Look, I can download that photograph, I think.
Yeah, you can. I've tried to download it and then share it, but it's not allowing me to do it, unfortunately.
Okay.
Which is a shame.
Right, it's saved into my downloads folder, so I'll have a good look at it later. Right, click the right button to go back, otherwise I will leave the session. Oh, you've downloaded some more images. Okay, so it's quite a young tree, is it? Or is this a twig that you've taken off it?
It's young. It's just appeared by itself. I don't know how long it's been there. It's just now starting to lean to the path.
Okay. Does anybody else know what it might be? Okay, it's got some interesting ridging on the twig as it goes down, but that for me is not. I mean, it's a bit like, might be a sort of snake-barked mapley type sort of thing, but not field maple. But it's not opposite buds. It's not a maple, that's for sure. So that's
Hoping it'll have some leaves soon. Should help.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to come back to you on that one.
Let me see if I can share
Great.
it. You see it there? Is everyone seeing it? At
Oh,
least
well
we
done,
can
you've
get
done
it
that.
onto the recording. There you go. So it's a bit of problem solving for homework then, Heather. Thank you. Anybody else got anything they want to ask or comment or share or suggest? If you've done something yourself that has helped you identify any trees in your woodland, is there anything that you recommend that others use? Always great to share. If you do come across something, please just drop us an email as well and let us know. We can share it through any of our newsletters, bulletins, social media. What I am going to do just now is, I've closed it down, that wasn't very clever of me. I'm going to share with you the feedback form if you wouldn't mind completing that for us. It's always useful to get an indication of what has been helpful, what's worked, what's not worked. Could we do things differently, better, worse? However that might be. Beech tree. I thought the buds looked like a beech bud, but
they're quite pointy, but they're too chunky. And beech, I don't think ever have that concertina twig look. They're always really slender. Here
we go. I don't think that form's going to take that out. Delete. Okay. If there is any other questions, now's your time, please. And if not, Piers, can I just thank you very much? I certainly have taken screeds of notes, and I'm going to go away and buy that Collins Tree Guide because I think that would be a good place to start. And take photographs of my notes so I can refer to them when I'm out and about, which is wonderful. So thank you so much for that. It was very informative. And I'm sure if you do have any more questions for Piers, you can email Piers. I'll put his email address in the chat. It's piers@communitywoods.org. If you have a think and you'd like to know more about anything, then please just drop Piers an email.
someone was asking before everybody goes, someone was asking about willow, and I didn't say much about willow. But what differentiates willows? It's one of what I said about willows earlier. Is it's one of the trees with triangular or diamond-shaped lenticels on the young bark. It's only got one leaf scale, so when you look at a bud scale, one bud scale, and the buds are very pressed against the twig. So when you look at, you may need a hand lens to really check, but you won't see any overlapping of bud scales. There will only be one entire bud scale covering the bud. And then in summer, for me, I kind of work with 2 or 3 different willows, and I then rubbish at everything else. Down the river Spey, we've got a lot of crack willow. That looks more like your standard osier, but it grows into biggish trees with quite yellowish looking long leaves. The goat willow has much more of a ovoid leaf, a blunt ovoid leaf. Eared willow, very much more restricted to boggy, acidy, boggy sort of countryside up in the Highlands and different places where the soil is poor, and it only ever grows into a big bush, never really into a big tree. But those willow leaves are much smaller, with kind of armpit leaves. They're little axillary leaves, kind of, or eared willows. That's why I think of, so you got the main blunt leaf, which is really quite small, and then 2 ears that hang off the side of the leaf where it comes out of the main stem. So that's eared willow, but a very scruffy looking bush and very restricted to low nutrient sites. Whereas the goat willow is more demanding of soil, is much more flexible about, won't grow on horrible bogs where eared willow grows, but it will grow on better soils and colonize not necessarily just wet areas. Whereas the crack willow on the river spey is just spreading up and down the river banks, because that's where the cracked off branches take root and things like that. So that's restricted to riparian areas, whereas the goat willow you'd find on old building sites. Sometimes it's a colonizer tree and grows along railway cuttings and so on and so forth. The grey willow, somewhere in between an eared willow and a goat willow, both in stature and in leaf form. That's my limit to the willows. And there's lots of montane willows, which I'm trying to get my head around, but I'm not very good at that yet. Some of the willows have very quite diminutive bushes and have very felty leaves, and others. There's a tea-leaved willow around us up in the hills, and it's got a much more elliptical, bright, fresh green. Yeah, not unlike a tea leaf, but not as glossy, shiny by any means, but much shinier than any other willow. Okay, that's my lot on willows.
Brilliant, Piers. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending and for asking all your questions, and Heather for your photos and whatnot. It's been wonderful. And Piers, thanks again. Much appreciated.
Thank you everyone for being there. Good to see you all. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.